History as it happens, November 15th, 2022. The end of Trumpism?
With the Democrats in control of both the White House and the Congress, we were held accountable yesterday, and I accept my share of the responsibility in the result of the elections.
For the last 2 years, we've made progress, but clearly too many Americans haven't felt that progress yet, and they told us that yesterday. And as president, I take responsibility for that.
Our democracy has been tested in recent years, but with their votes, the American people have spoken and proven once again that democracy is who we are.
Democrats were not trounced in the midterm elections. There was no red wave, despite high inflation and President Biden's low approval ratings. If anyone lost, it may have been Donald Trump, as voters rejected his favorite slate of election deniers. Populist waves come and go in American politics. Is this the sign that Trumpism is ebbing at last? Let's parse the midterms with Damon Linker next, as we report history as it happens. A podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
You know, American democracy is under attack because the defeated former president of the United States refuses to accept the results of the 2020 election. He refuses to accept the will of the people. He refuses to accept the fact that he lost.
I do think that there is a tendency on the left to want to reduce the appeal to the kind of the ugliest version of it. And it can be very effective because the ugliest version of it is in play. It is a factor.
The week before the midterm elections, President Biden delivered a primetime address that some observers said missed the mark.
In this moment, we have to confront those lies with the truth. The very future of our nation depends on it.
With inflation the number one issue on the minds of voters, why was the president again talking about more abstract notions of democracy with a partisan pitch? In other words, to save democracy, vote for Democrats.
Yet now, extreme MAGA Republicans aim to question not only the legitimacy of past elections, but elections being held now and into the future.
Well, as it turned out, the president wasn't so out of touch. Many Republicans who embraced Donald Trump's election lies lost their elections at the state and federal levels. Inflation, crime, immigration, abortion, culture war stuff, they were all important issues. But the president wanted Americans to look beyond specific issues to see the larger stakes. The very nature of the American project, as he saw it, hung in the balance.
The issue couldn't be clearer in my view. We, the people, must decide whether we will have fair and free elections, and every vote counts. We, the people, must decide whether we're going to sustain a republic where reality is accepted, the law is obeyed, and your vote is truly sacred.
Well, since the red wave never materialized, political scientists, journalists, pundits, historians, and activists have provided an array of explanations. I think it's safe to say there was no single cause of the Republicans' poor showing, although in some places they did quite well, like Florida. And it should also be noted that as I speak into this microphone in mid-November, the GOP is expected to take back the House. It'll be a small margin either way, but in all likelihood we will have divided government. And it's not apparent that both sides are really committed to working together to get things done, meaning the zero-sum politics that stands in the way of progress is likely to stick around. Now, if we look at recent history, after the incumbent party lost big, leaders did pledge to work together to get things done. Here is Bill Clinton after the '94 midterms.
I also called the leaders of the next Congress, Senator Dole and Congressman Gingrich, to tell them after this hard-fought campaign that we are ready to work together to serve all the American people in a nonpartisan manner.
And George W. Bush after the 2006 midterms.
There is a great opportunity for us to show the country that Republicans and Democrats are equally as patriotic and equally concerned about the future, and that we can work together.
And Bush was sitting alongside the new Senate Majority Leader, Harry Reid.
Election's over. The only way to move forward is with bipartisanship and openness.
And here is Barack Obama in 2010.
Some election nights are more fun than others. Some are exhilarating. Some are humbling. But every election, regardless of who wins and who loses, is a reminder that in our democracy, power rests not with those of us in elected office, but with the people we have the privilege to serve.
Now, you may remember in the days before Democrats lost 61 House seats in that midterm election, Senator Mitch McConnell gave an interview to the National Journal where he said Republicans had to avoid the same mistakes they made after the 94 midterms. He said, after 94, the public had the impression that we Republicans overpromised and underdelivered. We suffered from some degree of hubris and acted as if the president was irrelevant and we would roll over him. By the summer of 95, he was already on the way to being reelected, and we were hanging on for our lives. So then the interviewer asked McConnell, what does this mean now? And he said, we need to be honest with the public. This election is about them, not us. We need to treat this election as the first step in retaking the government. We need to say to everyone on Election Day, those of you who help make this a good day, you need to go out and help us finish the job. And then the interviewer asked, what's the job? And McConnell said, in now infamous words, the single most important thing we want to achieve is for President Obama to be a one-term president. But then McConnell added, in words that have been forgotten relative to those other ones, if President Obama does a Clintonian backflip, if he's willing to meet us halfway on some of the biggest issues, it's not inappropriate for us to do business with him. That was Mitch McConnell in 2010. So given how close the margins will be in the next Congress, compromise will be necessary if any major legislation is going to be passed. How far Republicans may be willing to go to work with President Biden and Democrats could depend on the degree to which Donald Trump maintains his influence over the GOP. Today, Tuesday, November 15th, the day this podcast is being published, Trump is actually scheduled to announce he'll run for president again. Trump himself was not on the ballot last week, but it sure seemed like he was, and now some on the right say it is time to move on from his toxic brand. Is Trumpism on the wane? Is it fading? In a decade from now, are we going to look back at this election as a turning point, an inflection point? Damon Linker is one of the most thoughtful political journalists of our time. He writes the Eyes on the Right substack. Damon Linker, welcome.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
From one Ithaca College alum to another, hello. I was in the class of 97. Remind me, which year were you?
91.
So you got a few years on you.
Yeah, a little bit.
We have a mutual friend, a mutual professor, historian Paul McBride, who has been a guest on my podcast a bunch of times. I'm going to make sure he listens to this episode, but just for entertainment purposes, no grading.
Yes, hopefully not. Yeah, I was a history major at Ithaca, and I studied with Paul, a guy named David McKeith, and I was especially close to Joe Tempesta, who was the kind of professor who could never survive in the contemporary academy.
Wow.
He would get drummed out because of harshness toward the students. I guess I was a glutton for punishment. And
well, if you got through Paul's lectures, then definitely so. But no, Paul is the best. I love having him on. So we'll get down to business now. Why was the conventional wisdom so wrong going into the election?
You know, people make judgments about politics based in part on kind of the track record, past, probabilities. What's the most likely thing to happen? And easily the most likely thing to happen in a midterm election when there's a Democrat in the White House and Democrats controlling both houses of Congress is that you're going to get a swing of a bunch of votes toward the other party, the Republicans in this case. And then when you add in the fact that the margins separating minority and majority in both houses of Congress for the last 2 years have been extremely narrow, just a handful of seats in the House and one seat in the Senate, by far the most reasonable expectation going in, with all else being equal, would be that you'd probably see a bit of a wave, something like maybe 25 or 30 seats switching to the Republicans. You might even expect, based on what we saw in 1994 and then in 2010, the last two midterm elections in which you had a Democrat in the White House. In those cases, the waves were much larger than that, but we have to keep in mind that in 2020, despite the fact that Biden won, the Republicans actually picked up 13 seats, which is unusual. So you could actually kind of factor that into the expectation and say, okay, yeah, 25 to 30 seats because they already picked up, say, 13 seats that one would expect them to pick up this year.
In many ways, Democrats lost the 2020 election, but...
Well, I mean, I don't want to even play with that just because you had a former president making it seem as if that was actually true.
I didn't mean it that way.
But it is the case that, I mean, Biden won. He won the popular vote by 7 million roughly votes. But if 45,000 votes in Wisconsin, Georgia, and Arizona had flipped, then Trump would have tied in the Electoral College, throwing the election into the House, where Trump almost certainly would have become president. And Trump also expanded on his 2016 popular vote total by 11 million votes. So, yeah, and then you add in the 13 House seats that went to the Republicans in that year, and it's a pretty muddled outcome.
And they're good in the governor's races, too, state legislatures.
So the Republicans did remarkably well that year, except for Trump.
Your most recent Substack, Midterm Postmortem, was very good. Everyone listening to this episode should seek that one out. It's called Eyes on the Right, if they're looking for the name of your Substack. You cautioned against people being wrong about the conventional wisdom coming out of the election, too. I mean, we just don't know everything, and maybe it's going to take some time to figure out what happened.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, there are a lot of votes, even as we're recording this, which is, now almost a week after the vote. We don't know the composition of the House. We don't know if it's probably going to switch to Republican control because, again, it was so narrow. It doesn't take very many net flips in order for it to go to the Republicans, but it might not. We'll see. A lot of outstanding votes in a bunch of states. California, of course, takes 3 or 4 years to count their votes. They're very slow. So we will see. But even aside from that, based on what we already know, there's some surprising things out there. Like, for instance, remember on Tuesday night when the votes were coming in of the midterm election, one of the first states to report is Florida. They're very efficient at counting their votes. And we learned that DeSantis wins re-election by about 19 points. So, and then also Marco Rubio won re-election by a lot. It's actually grown since that night. So if you just look at Florida, looks like we got the red wave everyone was predicting. Similarly, Ohio was pretty strong for the Republicans. J.D. Vance won pretty comfortably. Mike DeWine won re-election as governor by a very large margin.
And they don't seem like swing states anymore. They seem pretty solidly red.
Solidly red. And then New York State totally blows everybody away. Republicans made gains, I think, in almost every single precinct or however you break down the vote. They made gains throughout the state, huge gains on Long Island and Nassau County, so much so that some Democrats are already carping about how if the Republicans do, in fact, take the control of the House, it's all sort of New York State's fault. Of course, that's an arbitrary thing to single out New York State, but it is true. So in those states, Florida, Ohio, and New York, we got results that are pretty much what you would have expected to see in a Republican wave year. On the other hand, Michigan, which was one of the 3 big states from 2016, like, whoa, Trump scaled the blue wall. Now this is going to be the upper Midwest Rust Belt foundation of a new Trumpist Republican Party. Michigan has swung totally back toward the blue direction. A huge showing on all levels, from the governor's race through both houses of the legislature and more local races. Democrats just cleaning up, taking complete control of the state, seeming to take Michigan out of contention as a swing state in the other direction. And then a lot of other states, Pennsylvania, not quite as dramatic, but still, you have Josh Shapiro totally clocking Mastriano across the jaw and Fetterman winning. So it's a very mixed showing. It's not really what some of the media are already spinning it as. It's like, whoa, Democrats totally do great. They did unexpectedly well.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Candidate quality matters, said one Mitch McConnell.
Senate races are just different. They're statewide. Candidate quality has a lot to do with the outcome.
The horse race nature of political journalism does mean we have to say one side wins, one side loses. I'm with you. I think it's kind of split down the middle here. I'm more interested in deeper issues anyway, and so far we can discern them at this early hour, or at least try to identify a shift in popular mood that reveals itself in an election like this. Maybe a shift away from extremes.
Yeah, that's what I like to think as a good centrist. That's kind of my brand. And I do think if you're not looking at this purely through a partisan lens, either from the right or the left, I don't understand how you could look at these results and conclude anything other than America is an incredibly deeply and also narrowly divided country. We're talking about a result where the share of governors is going to be 25-25 or 26-24. I don't think it can be 25-25 based on the latest counts, but it's going to be very close. The Senate looks like it's going to be in Democratic hands, depending on the outcome of the Georgia runoff in about a month. It could end up being the Democrats have a net gain of one seat.
Yeah, it'll be 51-49 or 50-50.
Right, exactly. So, either they're going to have to rely once again on Kamala Harris's tie-breaking vote, or they won't by one vote. And then the House, again, we've been counting votes for almost a week so far, and it's pretty unclear which of the two parties is going to take control. So even if the Republicans do take control, it's going to still remain extremely close. I should also add the additional detail that it looks like the total popular vote for the House is actually swinging toward the Republicans. They could end up winning the total national vote by 3 or 4 percentage points over the Democrats, despite the Democrats doing so well, which shows that their electoral coalition wasn't actually as efficient this time as it has been recently. So we're so narrowly divided that you could actually end up with a situation where one party narrowly controls one institution, despite the fact that the other party actually won the most votes in those races. So this is not the picture of a country we're on the verge of a kind of breakthrough where you're going to have like 55 or 60% of the country siding with one party and the other party banished to be the longstanding minority. I think in some ways, American history over the last 100 years has been skewed by the experience of the 1930s, where we saw the Democrats completely dominate politics, where FDR wins 4 elections in a row. The Congress through that period was like super majorities for the Democrats. And then you had a brief moment in the 1960s with the 64 election where this happened again, and the Great Society comes out of that brief moment where the Democrats are completely dominating Congress. That longing for that again, both on the part of Democrats, but then as a dream for Republicans, that somehow you put everything together, Trump or some Trump successor, and the demographic shifts where Latino voters go to the right, everything will come together and there'll just be a tipping point and suddenly decisive victory for the Republicans. There's no evidence of this yet.
I agree. Go ahead.
I just wish that both sides would kind of stop governing as if they thought this was just one election away, because I think it leads to behavior that ends up actually producing a backlash that ends up demonstrating even more that it isn't true.
The days of like a Reagan Mondale type of landslide, Bush Dukakis. I mean, those days are over. I'm not necessarily sure that we need to have something like that again. But to your point about a thorough repudiation of Trumpism, a lot of people thought it was going to happen in 2020 because of his callous and incompetent way of handling the pandemic. Plus, he had been impeached over the Ukraine pressure campaign. And then after the January 6th attack on the Capitol and his complicity in that, it hasn't happened. If it were going to happen, it would have happened already.
I have to say that that's the way I look at it, but I do also think that we're in a period right now in the immediate shock and aftermath of the way the midterms unfolded, where there are a lot of Republicans in the media, major prominent conservative writers who are, working up a big head of steam here to try to do this again. Like the thing that they tried to do in the early days of the 2016 Republican primaries, which is to say, no, Trump, not good. He's not a conservative. We don't want him.
Well, the elites don't make that decision anymore because of the open primaries.
They keep hope alive. We are seeing it starting to work up. And I'm enough of a kind of self-checking skeptic. I'm willing to somewhat stand back and watch and see how all of this unfolds. Is it possible that from what we've seen post-midterm, that, for instance, unlike Trump in 2020, none of the so-called election-denying candidates like Mastriano and so forth have actually denied the results, have said, what, I lost? That's not true. There was voter fraud. We have to recount 1 million times and go to court 1 million times and prove that this was all just a kind of scam run by the Democratic machine. That was Trump's move in 2020. And so far, none of the acolytes who have portrayed themselves as with Trump on 2020 on this issue have actually followed through. And that's, I think, an extremely encouraging thing. And it does clarify that our problem is more a narrowly Trump problem than perhaps a Republican problem in general. It's not that the entire party has become absorbed by this kind of conspiratorial thinking about elections. And that means it is conceivable, if to use a metaphor I've stolen from Ross Douthat and I used in a recent post, if you squint and cock your head just right, it is possible to maybe see how some Trump voters may come out of this election, if they're not being goaded by everyone who's lost, to think somehow this is illegitimate, it didn't really happen this way, to say, actually, wow, like, some of our people are not winning. A little bit of rational calculation of self-interest might come into play and lead them to say, well, maybe we do need to nominate a DeSantis instead of Trump. That would be the case for this being a moment like that.
We're going to get to that. We're going to get to whether Trumpism is waning. That's actually the reason I invited you on. We're going to get to that in a moment, to my earlier point about how there hasn't been a thorough repudiation. Yet, at the same time, we know from American history that these populist waves come and go. Before we tackle those issues, though, a couple of more questions about the immediate aftermath of the election. First, on history, you're a history guy. Let's start with an axiom about American politics, and that is the party in power does do poorly in midterms. I mean, why is that? We just take it for granted, but why? With a few exceptions, of course.
Well, I think even in non-populist eras, it points to a base level populism to American politics, that we tend to be skeptical of political power. We fear tyranny most of all, I think far more than we fear civil unrest, actually. And I am not in that camp myself, which is one thing that contributes to some of my commentary being a little offside sometimes. But I do think that the general American instinct is whoever's in power, whoever holds political power, you're kind of going to be skeptical toward them, suspicious of them, sort of want to counterbalance whatever it is they're doing. So that is a kind of populist impulse. And that's why the big midterm swings of the last few decades were 1994. First time you have a Democrat in office, Bill Clinton, since before Reagan. So this is 12 years now. It's been all Republicans in power. Clinton wins, but he wins in a kind of a weird way because you had Ross Perot there as a third party. It's not clear would Clinton have even won if Ross Perot didn't run. Some political scientists have tried to figure that out, but I think it's inevitably uncertain. So he's in power. He comes out right away, leads out right after he gets into office with changing the rule on gays in the military, which really antagonizes
healthcare too.
Right. And then, of course, yes, like most of his first 2 years were devoted to putting Hillary Clinton, his wife, in charge of a committee to study healthcare reform. They come out with their report. It proposes a sweeping overhaul of the entire healthcare system, and it blows up, goes nowhere in Congress. And you get this backlash where the right shows up to vote, helped by Newt Gingrich motivating them with the Contract for America. And you get this huge sweep.
Yeah, like 50 seats, 55 seats, something like that.
Republicans take the House for the first time in 40 years. So huge sweep. And then again in 2010, Obama comes in. It's
61
kind of
seats.
Yes, 61 seats. The biggest switch in that case since I think it was back to 1949, or 48, something like that. So a huge sweep in sheer numbers and also very historic. So, and that was another case where the Democrat was in office after a Republican had been president, and he both bails out some of the big banks, the car industry because of the financial crisis, and then does Obamacare. So it's a kind of backlash to what you see. And then we also had a slightly smaller version of the same thing in the other direction in 2018, with Democrats doing very well with Trump in the White House and the Republicans controlling both houses of Congress.
One major exception to this rule, 1934, Franklin Roosevelt's first midterm elections. Democrats gain 9 seats in the House. They have a total of 322 versus only 103 for Republicans, who had lost 14 in that election. So Democrats already had a large majority because of how Herbert Hoover and the Republican Party were discredited after their handling of the Great Depression. And then in the Senate, Democrats gained 9 to reach 69 seats in the Senate. I mean, these margins are simply unthinkable nowadays. So
what that basically means is that from 34 to 36, the Democrats could have done almost anything. They could have just passed a series of amendments to the Constitution.
Yeah, I wonder how Democrats got FDR's program through Congress. I mean, 69 seats? Yeah. So many people criticizing Biden for not getting enough done, although he does have a pretty impressive slate of legislative wins. But it's 50-50, and our politics are so divided now, you kind of know that it's going to be 50-50 on almost all these major votes. Man, it's crazy. But
it is. And it shows also the craziness of a lot of the early Biden takes right after he won the election, the kind of giddy happiness of Democrats for having brought down Trump made a lot of people start to dream big, like this is going to be the biggest thing since, Lyndon Johnson, or even a New Deal. We're going to just pass tons of stuff. And they did, as you said, lots of legislative achievement, lots of spending, which in the end came and sort of bit the country on the behind because
inflation.
We ended up, it conjured up inflation, which has causes beyond the spending. It's happening around the world too. So it's not as simple as blaming the spending, but it certainly didn't help.
Damon, it is now said that every election is a national election, meaning that if a liberal Democrat running in San Francisco takes a hard left position on policing, whatever, then a conservative or more moderate Democrat running in, say, the New Jersey suburbs has to answer for that position. Is that really the case? Because it seems to me, at least in this midterm we just had, that specific candidates still made all the difference, as is often the case in politics. Individual candidates matter.
Well, it is a relief for me, at least, to see that ended up being the case this time. It wasn't clear. We were kind of running a test of the proposition. I mean, with candidates like Herschel Walker, who both was pretty thoroughly ignorant of policy. And then, on the few policies where he actually took a stand, he struck out a position on abortion that was extremely far out on the fringe, and then got hit by accusations that he personally paid for more than one abortion over the years. And so you had this terrible hypocrisy.
His position on climate change, too, was utter nonsense.
But since we don't control the air, our good air decided to float over to China, bad air. So when China gets our good air, their bad air got to move. So it moves over to our good air space. And now we got to clean that back up.
Yeah, and so what you ended up with was a kind of Republican argument in defense of him that amounted to something like the kind of claims that you have in parliamentary systems where you have like multi-member districts. And so it's like, it doesn't matter who you're voting for. It's not about the person. You're voting for the party. And then the party is kind of like an open slot. And it doesn't matter what body sits in that seat. It matters which party actually takes majority control or has enough to form a coalition with another party if you're in a parliamentary system. And so we had a kind of test of that. And in my own state of Pennsylvania with Mastriano, who also staked out really radical positions on things, including on election denying and abortion. The question, I think, for a lot of Republicans in Pennsylvania was, yeah, Mastriano sounds like kind of a lunatic, but at least he's a Republican. So if we vote for him, then that's good, because in general, I agree with Republicans far, far more than Democrats, and Democrats are terrible. Would that work? And it turns out it didn't work great. I mean, it might have worked in some races. Herschel Walker did come in a little behind Warnock. But it turned out because you have a Libertarian Party in Georgia that consistently gets about 2% of the vote, it's now pushed to a runoff, and we'll get to see.
Yeah, so I guess Walker could still win, but yeah.
He could still win, but if he does, I do think that it will be because, at least in a marginal case like this, something like what I was describing actually did function. It's probably not. I mean, given how far Walker ended up behind Brian Kemp in the results, I mean, Kemp easily won re-election and Walker didn't, which meant that you had a lot of people either not casting a vote for Senate who were Republicans, or they simply did ticket splitting.
I think that's the case across politics. I think a lot of people are voting for someone because they simply can't stand the other person.
Yeah, negative partisanship, the rule of the day.
So, Damon, you have written extensively, finally getting to the real reason I wanted to have you on here. My meandering interview style takes about 30 minutes to get to the point. You have written extensively about the ways in which the left in our country misunderstands the appeal in the U.S. and in other parts of the world of this right-wing populism, Orbanism, if you will, in Hungary. Tell us what you mean.
I do think that there is a tendency on the left to want to reduce the appeal to the kind of the ugliest version of it. And it can be very effective because the ugliest version of it is in play. It is a factor. So in the American context, a kind of racism, which is not like necessarily explicitly anti-Black racism, but a general sense that white America is dying out, and there are all these anxieties among white voters about the country evolving into something they don't like, and then reading that unhappiness in pure racial terms.
All white supremacy all the time is how I explain that view.
Exactly. So like it's about Black and brown America and wanting to reverse that or something like that. And again, is that part of it? Well, yeah. I mean, I think to the extent that it's real, a big part of it is a function of the fact that Trump, by staking out the policy positions he did and speaking the way he did, appealed to what I think of as a pretty narrow, tiny slice of the American population who are genuine bigots, racists, anti-Semites, neo-Nazis, KKK sympathizers, and so forth. Are there people like that in America? Of course. We're a country of 330 million people. These are parts of our past and our history, and these folks folks kind of keep alive and they perpetuate themselves in their little niches. And they're the kind of people who probably up until 2016 wouldn't have had either party as very appealing to them. But suddenly with Trump talking the way he was and staking out more paleo-conservative positions on policy and being kind of a full spectrum jerk and antagonizing people, that kind of reminded those folks of like, oh, this is the politics that we like. So they gravitated to him. And then Trump, in his boundless ambition and narcissism, was very happy to accept their endorsement and their support and very reluctant to ever denounce them and say, I don't want your support. And so because of that, there was some truth to this read of it. But I do think that a lot of those arguments that this is white supremacy, it's Jim Crow 2.0, and you hear everyone from, New York Times columnists to Joe Biden himself claiming such things. First of all, you can't explain it very much in those terms for the very fact that you're seeing similar movements all over the place. You see it in Hungary with Orban. You see it in Italy's recent election with Meloni's victory. You see it in Sweden with the victory of the anti-immigrant party there, or at least it's doing well enough to be a big part of the current government.
Brexit.
You see it with Bolsonaro's rise and now loss. Like, again, that's another election where, am I happy that Bolsonaro went down? Yes, and I'm also very happy he's accepted the results. But he got like 48% of the vote. So like, this is not like some decisive repudiation. It's a marginal few point swing in the other direction. So this shows that, again, this is, for the moment, this is a configuration of right-wing parties in liberal democracies across much of the globe right now.
And they're touching on issues that, again, go beyond kind of that base grievance, whether it's about race or whatever. There is an antipathy toward foreignness, I think, intrinsic in the movement. But how do you define Trumpism?
Trumpism is a complicated phenomenon, and there are certain things about Trumpism that are really distinct to him and distinct to the United States. So what I do is I've worked out kind of in real time on my Substack what I think of as 4 factors that play into Trumpism. And as I'll explain as I go through these briefly, when you go then to other would-be successors to Trump on the American right, I think you can see that not all of them have all 4 of these elements.
They don't have his personality, but I'll let you do your...
That's true.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let me work through these. So first, there's the one that policy intellectuals focus on most of all. That's policy. So what is distinct about Trump? Well, first of all, he was hostile to immigration far more than major figures in the Republican Party have been since at least Reagan.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
Very hostile, especially to illegal immigration, but in general skeptical of letting new people into the country. Secondly, he's skeptical of free trade, so he's in favor of tariffs and making trade agreements much more on the basis of trying to prop up American industry and working class workers as opposed to service workers. So against globalization in that sense, like outsourcing of industries to cheaper markets. He's also, of course, was skeptical of the foreign policy regime that certainly dominated the Republican Party from 9/11 on. Before that, it was a little more mixed, with the Republicans combining Reaganite championing of democracy with being a little more skeptical of foreign entanglements and nation building and so forth. So those are kind of the major policy innovations of Trump, and they definitely are a factor in it. There's a little bit of an additional, at least rhetorical pivot away from hostility to like Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare that you saw very much at the forefront with Paul Ryan and then with the Romney-Ryan campaign in 2012.
That's right. Trump did not run on getting rid of those programs.
He did not, although he governed in a way that was more Ryan-ish than one might have expected from the way he ran.
Well, tax cuts, appointing federal
he even
judges.
rhetorically talked in 2016 about being in favor of universal health insurance. And again, that went absolutely nowhere when he was actually president, but he talked that way. So those are the innovations. I guess one other little thing on policy is a real doubling down on culture war issues, especially on abortion. All right, second factor, bellicosity, the kind of he fights phenomenon, the fact that Republicans really loved that Trump just didn't give a crap. He just sort of stood up there and took on anybody and everyone he didn't like, including members of the Republican establishment. And so
John McCain, Jeb Bush.
Yeah, and well, all the other 16 rivals for the nomination in 2016, taking Jeb Bush on, taking on George W. Bush, calling the Iraq War a disaster, a Republican saying the Iraq War was a disaster over and over again from a debate stage.
Obviously, the war in Iraq was a big, fat mistake, all right? Now, you can take it any way you want, and it took Jeb Bush, if you remember at the beginning of his announcement, when he announced for president, took him 5 days. He went back. It was a mistake. It wasn't a mistake. Took him 5 days before his people told him what to say. And he ultimately said it was a mistake. The war in Iraq, we spent $2 trillion, thousands of lives. We don't even have it. Iran is taking over Iraq with the second largest oil reserves in the world.
The Republican base ate that up. They loved it. So that's the bellicosity factor. The third one is what I call the trash factor. That's related to the bellicosity factor, but this is Trump as infomercial or infotainment person, WWF kind of aesthetic, where he stands up on a stage and just sort of spews out insults and attacks, often in a very vulgar way, using vulgarity. I don't know what the rules are in your podcast for what I'm allowed to say.
Go say whatever you'd like.
Well, calling Ted Cruz a pussy from the stage at a rally, using the F-bomb in rallies and so forth, just showing pure contempt. And you never know what he's going to say.
He mocked disabled people too.
Mocking disabled people verbally, but also with you can't see because this is just a podcast, but looking like he's having a Tourette's moment, shaking and moving his hands around, really making fun of someone with disabilities.
And now the poor guy, you got to see this guy. Oh, I don't know what I said. I don't remember.
Jonathan Last, who writes for The Bulwark, had a good post up about Carrie Lake's appeal. She's another one of these candidates. We don't know her fate yet as we're recording this in Arizona. But, she has this trash factor in spades. There was an event that she had a month or so ago in the campaign where DeSantis came and they spoke together. And she made a point after he appeared about talking about how he has BDE, she said from the stage.
I'll tell you what he's got. I don't know if you heard of this, but he's got BDE. Anybody know what that means? Ask your kids about it later. I call it big DeSantis energy. Right? He's got the same kind of BDE that President Trump has.
Which means big energy. And she said it over and over again and with a wink. That is pure trash talk, like the kind of thing that makes you, when you watch her and listen to her, you don't know what the hell she's going to say next. Trump did that. She does that. DeSantis, I don't think, has the trash factor. I don't think he intuitively can do that. That's kind of whipping the crowd up into a froth. I would even put under that category Trump's attacks on the media, calling them the enemy of the people to get cheers and so forth. So finally, the last factor is the delusion factor. And that's the stuff most clearly wrapped up with Trump's distinctive conspiratorialism. Everything going all the way back to the initial days of the Trump administration, where he stands up at a press avail at the CIA headquarters and claims that he had the biggest crowd in American history at his inauguration, when the photographic evidence very clearly shows that he's lying, and yet he says it over and over. Make Sean Spicer repeat it before the press corps.
Photographs of the inaugural proceedings were intentionally framed in a way, in one particular tweet, to minimize the enormous support that had gathered on the National Mall.
And then all the way down, of course, to the events leading up to January 6th of him simply lying about the results.
That's part of populism.
It is, but not always to that extent.
Yeah.
I have a hard time imagining if Viktor Orban had managed to lose his last election. Now, maybe you could say he never would have because he stacked the deck so much. He manipulates the media there, so he gets lots of favorable coverage and the opposition has to struggle. So that does give him an edge. But if his party, the Fidesz party, actually went down to defeat, I have a hard time imagining him spin 2 months of lies about how, in fact, he actually won. And the evidence is Bolsonaro. I mean, that was only a few percentage points. He lost by, would have been the easiest thing, much easier than it was in Trump's case, where he had all these individual states that had to be reversed in order to change the outcome. You're not even seeing it from Mastriano and the other election deniers in our country. So I think that shows that as much as Republicans are willing to dabble in this kind of delusion mongering, the extent to which they're really willing to push it all the way to an insurrection at the national legislature, Trump may be unique in that fact.
Well, Damon, first I'll say you win the prize for the longest explanation of what is Trumpism, but that's all right. You raised many good points. So let's start with Trump himself. Yes, a big part of Trumpism's appeal is him. Raising the question, can there be Trumpism after Trump? One of the very first episodes of this podcast, way back in early 2021, I interviewed a historian about whether Trump's appeal can endure. His narrative of a stolen election still remains to be seen in the final analysis. As far as the conspiratorial thinking goes, I mean, that's another huge part of this. Maybe the election denial is running out of steam. It's only going to get more stale and out of touch in 2 more years. But the very notion that the real world isn't real and our version of it is the one you should subscribe to, still very much ingrained in the base.
That's right. Although the question about the future always has to raise the question of which of these factors is decisive, or does it have to be all? Do they all have to be there? If they do all have to be there, then that's the case for Trump is really the only person who's really going to make the Republican base happy.
That's right. We could see from some of the other candidates just now who were like him or hoping to be like him, it didn't work. I mean, he does have a certain sway over people that others can't imitate.
He's good at humor. He's often funny, kind of self-deprecating in a weird way that makes him going to a rally a kind of big event. And some nights he doesn't really have it, and other nights he's better. But there is something distinctive about him mixing these 4 factors that I listed, combined with that distinctive charm that he has, that I think will be hard to replicate. I do think that a lot of conservative intellectuals, kind of the crowd around National Review, for example, tend to do what intellectuals often do, which is overplay the importance of policy. Not that policy isn't important. It is hugely important. But overassume that average American voters are voting for policy.
No, they're not.
That they're sitting there going well, I really would like this change to happen and how Social Security is paid for, or this on foreign policy, when in fact that's 1 factor among 10 and probably down near the bottom of the list of important ones.
Well, they're voting for how policies affect them, even if they're not policy analysts. And that'll bring me to one of my final observations here about the appeal of Trumpism. Again, without being able to say today whether it can endure beyond Trump himself, right? If there is a Trumpism after Trump, and whether it is waning now, it could be. And that is, Trump's appeal is the same appeal that you see in other parts of the world. It is anti-establishment. It is rural versus metropolitan. It is a big middle finger to globalization. And that is why opposition to free trade deals that really hurt the United States, talking about NAFTA and talking about, the Rust Belt. Pat Buchanan brought these very issues up in 1992. Perot brought them up in 1990. Well, that was also 92.
Yeah, 92, and then 96 again.
Yeah, Trump didn't come out of nowhere. This is Buchananism. There's also a George Wallace strain to this as well. Anti-establishment. If you go back and listen to George Wallace's speeches, he rails against the establishment. That is the appeal here. And so I think it's incumbent upon us, not just you and I, just people in general, to try to get our minds wrapped around that, to determine if it's going to last, because these populist waves do come and go in our politics. Maybe this one is now, maybe the fever is starting to break.
They do come in waves, and usually when they dissipate, it's because one or the other party or both have absorbed some of that energy and taken on those issues. They co-opt them in order to prevail over the other party. So the waves of the original populists in the late 19th century, contributed to the progressive movement, and the progressive movement got absorbed into the Democratic Party mostly. And the end result, I think, is the New Deal a couple of decades later. The truth behind some of the critics of Reagan from the left that it's kind of all sublimated racism. I think that goes way too far, but it is also true that the Southern strategy under Nixon and then the success of Ronald Reagan just a little bit later do speak to the fact that with the Democrats' shift toward pro-federal civil rights legislation, the Democrats' electoral coalition broke apart, and it was self-interested for the Republicans to try to absorb that energy of people who had been kind of abandoned by the Democrats.
That's the George Wallace influence.
The segregationists, the Wallace voters, especially in 68, where he wins not only in the South, he wins double digits in Michigan and other Rust Belt states. So as you said, those are proto-Trump voters, half a century ago.
So although Donald Trump does not seem to embrace democracy, and he did try to overturn the 2020 election, he tried to steal it from Biden, not the other way around. I don't think our concern right now, and I could be wrong about that, is the end of democracy in the United States. The Republican Party is not trying to overthrow democracy by and large. This is not a fascist revolutionary movement. Your final thoughts on that aspect of this election, because Biden was criticized for his speeches sounding out of touch when everyone was thinking about inflation. I thought Biden's speeches, they were partisan, but maybe he also overstated the threat to democracy. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that was generally my view. I really liked a post that Josh Barrow wrote about a week before the election that got a lot of attention and now has kind of come in for a lot of abuse because he was making the case against Biden's speech, couching the election in terms of this existential threat to democracy from the right. Even if that were true, I don't think the president, who's the head of one of the two parties, is the right person to deliver that message. It can't help but sound self-serving, like, we have to save democracy, so vote for my party, so I can then do with my party exactly what I would have done in any case anyway. But then again, we have the results where the Democrats did much better than expected, and so that's now going to be in the mix of like, well, maybe that speech really helped. Maybe that message from Democrats was a good one. But I do think, however much Trump himself remains a serious threat, and I do think he does, to the functioning of the rule of law and liberal democratic exchange of power and transfer of power, I also think that it would be good for our politics if Democrats stop speaking in terms of this being as if the entire Republican Party is kind of with him on that. And it, like, at their first opportunity, Republicans will win power and then call off any future election. It's like they're just going to declare themselves the permanent emperors of America. I don't think, aside from Trump personally who might dream of such a thing, I don't worry, for instance, that DeSantis is going to do something like that. I think DeSantis is a perfectly regular Republican who's decided that his political fate will be decided by how well he can play a populist on television.
Yeah, right-wing populists are doing very well in elections. They're not looking to overthrow democracy. They're doing fine in democracy, with Trump, of course, being a notable exception to that.
And of course, as we said earlier, I mean, I keep bringing up Bolsonaro because his election was like only a week or so before our election. But the fact that he lost narrowly and has agreed to step down, what does that mean? It means he did not try to install himself as a dictator. He didn't try to lead a coup, and Brazil has a history of coups. Yes. So they're a pretty ripe target for a coup if he had wished to try to lead one. But it also means he can be back. Other right-wing populists can be back in other election cycles, which means this is kind of, at the moment at least, right-leaning parties throughout the democratic world are that kind of right-winger. They are populists, insurgents against people in power. And that means that like the normal give and take and oscillation back and forth between parties in liberal democracies is going to have populists in the mix for the time being.
And, I don't want to understate the problem. There were a couple of hundred, I think even 300 people running for office on the Republican side who questioned the 2020 result. And many of them were running for Secretary of State at the state level, where they would be in charge of the vote counting the next time around. But those people lost. Final question to you. I listened to part of your conversation with the great Andrew Sullivan recently. Right now, you think Trump is still going to, if he runs and doesn't get indicted, I guess, going to be the 2024 nominee, that DeSantis, as of today, can't beat him. Is that right?
Well, I mean, yes, that is my view, but I very much need to include an asterisk there, is that, like, I don't know. I mean, whatever, we'll see. Like,
Neither do I.
I'm not making a hard and fast prediction. All I'm saying is that I learned a valuable lesson in 2016, actually in 2015, because it was still in 2015, because of course Trump announced his campaign in the third week of June 2015. So from around September, I believe, of that year, Trump was in the lead, and it became very quickly a solid and, I thought, pretty decisive lead. And I began saying on Twitter back in 2015 that unless I see Trump start to capsize, he's the front runner. He's winning. He's going to be the nominee unless something changes. And of course, it never really did. So my attitude at the moment is I look at the polls, and at least as of the most recent polls that I've seen, Trump's at around 50% support. DeSantis is around 20-25, and everybody else is in single digits. That tells me Trump's winning. And unless we see that change in a pretty decisive way, Trump come down to 45, 40, 35, 30, DeSantis go 25, 30, 40, 45. If they don't cross on that tracking poll and Real Clear Politics at some point, this is all a kind of abstract argument. And I don't believe in anointing people front runners when they're not actually the front runner. And at the moment, Trump very much is. So we'll have to see what unfolds if he announces. And
I mean, no one.
I will add, though, you did say if he isn't indicted. I actually think if he gets indicted, that could actually help him. Because I think there are a fair number of Republican voters who will delight at the extra middle finger that will allow them to give the establishment by keeping him the front runner while he's actually indicted.
So, in other words, forget about normal politics at that end of the spectrum. Damon Linker of Eyes on the Right Substack, we thank you. On the next episode of History as It Happens, it's been said there's a personality cult around Donald Trump. And as with any charismatic political figure, the myth is manufactured. The image is a creation. But that image is critical to the exercise of political power. Just see 20th century Europe. Historian Ian Kershaw is out with a new book on the personalities that shaped that century, from Lenin to Hitler to Thatcher to Gorbachev, with valuable lessons for the way we understand our world today. And that's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.